The bustling chaos of JFK Airport came to a screeching halt in an instant. A loud slap echoed through the crowd, leaving an elderly woman's cane clattering to the floor. The source of the commotion? A flight attendant, brimming with arrogance, had just humiliated the woman, without knowing who she truly was. What happens next will shock you. Subscribe now and don't miss the twist in this powerful story of judgment, power, and redemption. The air at JFK was thick with tension. Passengers hurried to and fro, their hurried footsteps echoing off the sterile floors as overhead announcements blended into the cacophony. Amid the chaos, an unexpected silence swept over the crowd. It was as if the universe had paused in that one moment, holding its breath. Caroline Whitmore, the young flight attendant, stood before Meredith Winslow, her eyes narrow with thinly veiled contempt. The elderly woman, hunched by age but not by spirit, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meredith had been waiting quietly, cane in hand, when Caroline had snapped at her to move aside. The words hit like a slap. "First class is not for people like you," Caroline had sneered, her voice cutting through the crowd, loud enough for everyone to hear. Meredith had flinched, her frail hand trembling slightly, but she didn't retreat. She didn't shout, didn't beg for respect. Instead, she stood tall, her pale blue eyes locking onto Caroline's with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through the gathered crowd. In that moment, everyone around them seemed to hold their breath, watching with bated anticipation. Meredith's presence was commanding, her calm a stark contrast to the flight attendant's agitated frustration. "I told you to step aside," Caroline repeated, more aggressively this time, her impatience growing. Meredith's eyes didn't waver. "You've made a grave mistake," she said softly, but her words were laden with something deeper, something far more powerful than anger. It was the kind of calm that makes people uneasy, the kind that feels like an impending storm, held back only by sheer force of will. Caroline's lip curled, dismissing the elderly woman with a flick of her wrist. "What's your problem, old woman? You don't belong here. Move." Meredith didn't flinch. She simply reached down slowly with a grace that betrayed her age and picked up the cane that had slipped from her grasp. Her fingers closed around it gently, but firmly, as though the cane itself symbolized something much larger than just an object of support. It was a symbol of her dignity, of years of enduring the weight of the world without losing her balance. The crowd around them began to stir, whispers starting to grow. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the two women. Others pretended to be engrossed in their phones or luggage, but their attention was unmistakably fixed on the unfolding drama. Then something changed. As Meredith straightened, her gaze never left Caroline's. There was no trace of anger, no hint of fear, only a quiet defiance. The stillness in her posture was palpable, almost suffocating, and in that moment Caroline knew something had shifted. She'd underestimated the woman in front of her. "You've made a serious mistake," Meredith said again, her voice now carrying a deeper weight, each syllable slow, deliberate. It wasn't an empty threat. It was a quiet warning, a reminder that every action has a consequence. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, but she didn't care. Caroline was the one whose world was about to tilt on its axis. Caroline scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Her arrogance wavered for just a split second. In the quiet space between them, she could almost feel the change in the air. What was it about this woman that made her so unshakable? But the moment was fleeting. Before Caroline could lash out again, a shadow appeared behind her, a figure cutting through the sea of people. Evelyn Crawford entered the scene. She was a woman who commanded attention without uttering a single word. Her salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, her emerald green outfit adding an air of quiet elegance. She moved with purpose, her steps measured and deliberate. The crowd subconsciously parted as she passed, the hum of the airport briefly quieting in her wake. Evelyn's presence was like a still, calm lake in the middle of a storm. But as she approached the scene, her sharp eyes flicked to Caroline and then to Meredith, instantly assessing the situation. It was clear to Evelyn that this was no ordinary confrontation. She had been a passenger in this airport many times before, but never had she witnessed such a blatant display of disrespect. Julia Monroe, another flight attendant, appeared in her path. Julia's blonde hair was neatly pulled back, her professional uniform crisp and immaculate. However, her demeanor was anything but professional. She was fuming, her eyes locked on the elderly woman as if trying to size her up. "Excuse me, ma'am," Julia said, stepping forward, blocking Evelyn's path. Her voice was colder now, her earlier confidence replaced with a thinly veiled irritation. "This is first class. I need to see your ticket." Evelyn didn't flinch. Her gaze remained calm, calculating. She was used to being underestimated, and she could feel the judgment swirling in the air. The power dynamic had already begun to shift. "I know where I'm standing, young lady," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and steady, almost too calm. "I'm perfectly aware of where I belong." Her words were sharp but not raised in anger. She spoke with the kind of authority that made Julia's skin crawl. The crowd was watching intently now. Every word, every gesture held weight, and that was when it happened. Julia reached for Evelyn's ticket, her fingers brushing against the older woman's hand. But Evelyn was faster. In an instant, Evelyn lifted her hand, avoiding Julia's grasp. In a flash of uncontrolled fury, Julia slapped Evelyn's hand, the sound of the contact ringing through the terminal like a gunshot. The cane fell from Evelyn's grasp, clattering loudly against the polished floor. The sound reverberated through the airport, amplifying the shock and disbelief that hung in the air. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to stand still. Evelyn's eyes, filled with a cold disappointment, locked onto Julia's face. There was no anger there, just deep, quiet contempt. A chilling silence followed, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the nearby passengers. What had just happened? Julia, standing frozen, her hand still hanging in the air, felt the eyes of the entire terminal upon her. She had just crossed a line. The crowd was no longer just witnessing a moment of tension. They were witnessing something far bigger, an eruption of years of prejudices, assumptions, and unspoken power dynamics that could no longer stay hidden. The moment wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about all the silent judgments people like Julia had made their entire lives. And now, that silence had been shattered, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "You've just made a serious mistake, young lady," she repeated, this time with more emphasis. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. As the silence hung heavy in the air, another figure emerged from the crowd. Sebastian Hartley, a young businessman in his early 30s, had been sitting quietly in the VIP lounge, quietly observing the entire scene unfold. He had been focused on his laptop, working through a set of emails, when the commotion at the boarding gate caught his attention. At first, it seemed like just another heated exchange, something routine in the chaos of a busy airport. But as he looked up and saw the flight attendant's aggressive stance toward the elderly woman, something about the situation struck him as wrong. Sebastian had always prided himself on his ability to stay composed, to keep his head down and mind his business. But there was something about the way the elderly woman, Evelyn Crawford, had handled the situation that drew him in. He was no stranger to the corporate world, had rubbed shoulders with CEOs and high-powered executives. He had seen many people in powerful positions who were quick to assert themselves, their presence undeniable. But Evelyn wasn't like that. There was a quiet strength in her demeanor, a calm that didn't demand attention but effortlessly commanded. Yet as he stood up from his seat, his gaze fixed on the confrontation. Julia Monroe, the flight attendant, was becoming increasingly agitated. Her voice was rising, her words laced with growing frustration. But Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she stood there, her posture as dignified as ever. It was then that the slap rang out, louder than anything he had anticipated. It hit the air with the sharpness of a gunshot, sending a jolt through the crowd. Sebastian's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. He watched as Evelyn's cane clattered to the ground, its fall seeming to reverberate throughout the terminal. The silence was deafening, filled with tension as every eye in the terminal turned toward the two women. He could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a simple disagreement between two people. This was something much deeper, a clash of dignity, authority, and deep-seated prejudices. Sebastian's mind raced. He was well-versed in reading people, having spent years negotiating with powerful figures. But there was something unsettling about Julia's actions. She wasn't just acting out of professionalism or frustration. There was something more to it: prejudice. He could see it now in the way Julia held herself, the dismissive way she had looked at Evelyn, sizing her up, assuming she didn't belong. In first class, he had seen that look before in the boardrooms, in the meetings where people like Evelyn were often dismissed because they didn't fit a particular mold. But what was even more troubling was how Julia seemed so sure of her actions. There was no hesitation, no self-awareness, only a cold, authoritative air that made it clear she thought herself above Evelyn. That arrogance, that entitlement, it was something Sebastian had seen all too often in his career. People who climbed to the top without ever questioning the system that had elevated them. People who believed their position entitled them to treat others as inferior. And yet, Evelyn Crawford remained unmoved. She didn't lash out, didn't retaliate with anger. She simply bent down, collected her cane from the floor, and stood tall, her gaze never leaving Julia's. Her calm was terrifying. Evelyn's quiet strength seemed to fill the space around them, creating an invisible barrier that even Julia couldn't penetrate. Sebastian couldn't help but feel a rush of admiration for the woman. In a world where everyone seemed so quick to react, to defend their ego, Evelyn had chosen silence. And in that silence, she had taken control. The crowd around them began to stir, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some passengers exchanged looks, their discomfort palpable. It was clear that everyone had witnessed something far beyond the ordinary, as Evelyn's quiet words to Julia pierced the tense silence. "You've made a serious mistake." Sebastian's admiration deepened. This wasn't just about the altercation. It was about the power dynamics at play. Evelyn was teaching everyone around her a lesson, though none of them realized it yet. But even as he watched the situation unfold, Sebastian couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt tugging at him. He had been a passive observer. He had seen the injustice, felt the tension, building, but had done nothing. He had told himself it wasn't his place to intervene, that he wasn't involved in this. But now, watching Evelyn face the consequences of Julia's arrogance with such grace, he couldn't deny that he, too, had been complicit in the unspoken biases that ran rampant in society. The air around him thickened with tension, the realization that this moment would forever change how he viewed the world. Evelyn's quiet strength wasn't just about holding her ground. It was about teaching others to see beyond the surface, to confront the prejudices they held without even realizing it. Sebastian's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Richard Montgomery, the senior manager of the airline, who approached with a sense of urgency. The situation had escalated. The apology was inevitable, but it wasn't just for Evelyn. It was for the hundreds, maybe thousands, who had suffered under the same biases Julia had displayed today. As Richard publicly acknowledged Evelyn's rightful place, Sebastian felt a deep pang of discomfort. This moment wasn't just a personal confrontation. It was a reflection of the systemic issues that had long been ignored. Julia's actions weren't isolated. They were the manifestation of a much larger problem. Sebastian's thoughts were interrupted again as the crowd around him continued to murmur. He didn't know how the situation would unfold next, but he knew one thing: the world would never be the same for him after this moment. As Evelyn stood before him, her calm demeanor unwavering, he felt a growing respect, not just for her as a person, but for the values she represented: dignity, respect, equality, all of which he realized had been too easily forgotten in the rush of his own life. As the confrontation began to resolve and the tension began to ease, Sebastian made a silent promise to himself to be more than just an observer in the world. He would take a stand, just as Evelyn had, and challenge the prejudices that lay buried in his own mind. But for now, the moment was not over. Evelyn Crawford had just begun to teach everyone around her the hardest lesson of all. That true strength wasn't about asserting power, but about showing grace in the face of adversity. The air was thick with tension, a stifling weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the terminal. The crowd around them had grown, a mixture of passengers pretending to adjust their luggage or check their phones, but their eyes were unmistakably locked onto the unfolding drama between Evelyn Crawford and Julia Monroe. Every word, every action from either woman seemed to echo through the crowded space, amplifying the stakes of this confrontation. Julia Monroe, a flight attendant known for her strict adherence to rules and the powerful authoritative way she carried herself, was quickly losing her composure. Her lip trembled as she gripped the boarding list tightly, her fingers curling around it like a lifeline. She had never been challenged like this before. Who did this woman think she was, standing in front of her, refusing to comply with her demands? As Julia stepped forward, the disdain on her face was apparent to everyone who was watching. She moved with a purposeful stride, her blue eyes narrowed with the kind of cold judgment that often came with her position. "I told you this area is for first-class passengers only," Julia snapped, her voice rising just slightly, though the edge in it was unmistakable. "I need to see your ticket now." Evelyn didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem to breathe the way the others did, their tension palpable in the thick atmosphere. Evelyn stood still, her gaze unyielding as she slowly lifted her eyes to meet Julia's, a sharp, unspoken challenge hanging between them. Evelyn didn't speak right away. Her silence seemed to scream louder than any words could. The crowd held, its breath, all of them sensing something was coming, something big. Julia felt a spark of irritation flare inside her, her jaw tightening. "I said step aside," she repeated, but now there was a noticeable tremor in her voice. The unshakable confidence she usually wore was cracking. Evelyn's calmness was maddening. Julia could see it now, and it only made her more agitated. Here was this older woman, calm and composed in the face of her authority, with that quiet dignity that demanded respect. But Julia wasn't ready to let this go, not without a fight. She was the one in control here, or at least she should have been. Without warning, Julia stepped forward aggressively, her hand outstretched to grab the ticket from Evelyn's grasp. But Evelyn was faster. In a fluid motion, she lifted her hand, instinctively avoiding Julia's grasp, the cane gently swaying in her hand. That was the breaking point. Julia's frustration boiled over. Her eyes flashed with a mix of disbelief and contempt. She wasn't going to back down now. With a swift motion, Julia reached out and slapped Evelyn's hand, the sound of it loud enough to send a shockwave through the crowd. The slap rang out like a gunshot. It was sharp, shocking, and it echoed through the terminal. Evelyn's cane, which had been her steadfast companion, slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a loud clatter. The world seemed to pause. The surrounding passengers gasped, their mouths agape and their eyes wide with shock. Evelyn's face didn't show anger, not even a hint of it. Instead, a quiet, piercing disappointment radiated from her. Her eyes, filled not with rage but with a deep, sorrowful calm, locked onto Julia. For a moment, the crowd felt the shift, a subtle but profound transformation in the air. Julia stood frozen, her hand still suspended in the air, caught in the aftermath of her own actions. The expression on her face was one of shock, as though she hadn't fully processed what she had just done. But the real tension came not from the slap, it was from the realization that Julia had just crossed a line, one she couldn't undo. Evelyn, now holding her cane again, stood tall. There was no flinch in her, no hesitation. She didn't scream, didn't yell. Her eyes were steady and composed, her voice breaking the silence with quiet authority. "You've made a serious mistake," she said, each word landing with more force than any shouted command could have. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and the air felt thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a minor confrontation anymore. It was a battle of wills, a clash of dignity versus arrogance, grace versus entitlement. Julia had been used to power, to being the one in charge. But here, in this moment, she was being exposed for something much more painful, her own prejudices. The tension between them was palpable. Julia was still struggling with the aftermath of her actions, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her hand, still trembling, fell to her side. She was embarrassed, but more than that, she was angry. Angry at herself. Angry at Evelyn for challenging her, for making her feel small. The crowd was watching and no one dared to intervene. There was an unspoken understanding among the passengers. This was no longer about the flight or the first-class seating. It was about something much bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. The moment stretched on, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the situation shifted again. A man tall and commanding entered the scene. Richard Montgomery, the senior manager of the airline, had arrived. His presence immediately demanded attention. As he walked towards the two women, the crowd instinctively parted, and the weight of the moment shifted again. Richard's gaze swept over the scene, his eyes flicking from Julia's flushed face to Evelyn's unbroken composure. Without a word, he stepped forward and apologized to Evelyn in the calmest, most formal tone imaginable. Evelyn, still composed, acknowledged his apology with a nod, but her eyes never left Julia's. The apology wasn't just for the slap. It was for the entire system that had allowed Julia's prejudice to go unchecked, that had allowed people to treat others with such disdain, based purely on their appearance or status. It was a wake-up call, and Evelyn's eyes held a warning for anyone who was watching. The consequences of such actions were never as simple as they seemed. Julia stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of her actions now dawning on her. She had just made an enemy of someone much more powerful than she had ever imagined, and it was in that moment that she realized the power she thought she had was never real. It was an illusion. Evelyn had not only exposed her for what she was, but had also shown her what true strength looked like. And now Julia was left to reckon with it. The tension in the airport had simmered down, but it was far from over. The confrontation between Julia Monroe and Evelyn Crawford had left its mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Julia stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart heavy, her mind still racing. The initial wave of anger and defiance had been replaced by something deeper, remorse. But it wasn't enough. Evelyn, on the other hand, had maintained her composure throughout it all. Her calm, dignified presence had been unwavering, even in the face of disrespect. She had never sought revenge or made a spectacle of Julia's behavior. Instead, Evelyn's response was a quiet lesson in grace, strength, and the profound understanding that true power doesn't need to be forced or shouted. It simply is. As the crowd dispersed, Richard Montgomery, the senior manager, took Julia aside. His face was stern, his words clipped. "What happened here today is a serious matter," he said, the weight of his tone underscoring the gravity of the situation. "You've crossed a line that goes beyond professionalism, but this can be an opportunity for growth." The words stung, but they were necessary. Julia had expected consequences, but she hadn't fully prepared herself for what was about to happen. The apology she had made to Evelyn was just the beginning. The company had already decided that her punishment would not be immediate termination, but rather something much harder, a journey of self-reflection and transformation. Over the next 6 months, Julia underwent a rigorous training program designed to make her confront her own biases and prejudices. Cultural awareness, racial sensitivity, and the history of discrimination were just a few of the subjects she studied. Every day she wrestled with her own discomfort, forcing herself to see the world through a different lens, one that acknowledged the pain and struggle of those she had once dismissed. At first, it was difficult for Julia. Her pride fought her at every turn. She resisted the exercises, tried to justify her past actions, but the program was relentless. It wasn't just about completing assignments. It was about changing the way she saw people, the way she interacted with the world. It forced her to confront the layers of prejudice she had built over the years, often without even realizing it. As the months passed, something inside her began to shift. The walls she had built up around herself started to crumble. Julia realized that the greatest challenge was not the training. It was coming to terms with the fact that she had been wrong. She had been complicit in a system that had allowed her to think she was better than others, simply because of her race, her appearance, and her position. The more Julia learned, the more uncomfortable she became. She could no longer deny the impact of her actions. The faces of the people she had judged, the ones she had looked down upon for reasons as shallow as skin color or attire, haunted her. She saw their faces in every passenger she encountered, in every new situation that made her feel uncertain. Her past mistakes weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't erase them. She had to accept them as part of her journey. By the time her training was nearing completion, Julia had begun to change in ways she never thought possible. She had become more compassionate, more willing to listen to the stories of others, to see people as they were, rather than through the distorted lens of her own biases. And she began to understand Evelyn's lesson more deeply. True strength isn't about asserting power or maintaining control. It's about showing empathy and acknowledging the humanity in everyone, no matter their status or appearance. It wasn't an easy path, and it wasn't a quick fix. Julia knew her transformation wasn't complete. That would take years, if not a lifetime. But the lessons she had learned from Evelyn, from the pain she had caused and the forgiveness she had received, had set her on a new path. She had to rebuild not only her career but her identity, and that was no small task. The final moment of her training came when she had to present her journey to Evelyn Crawford and the Airline's board. Standing before them, her heart pounding. In her chest, Julia felt a rush of vulnerability. This wasn't just a report. It was a reckoning, an honest reflection of how far she had come and how much farther she still had to go. "I used to think I was a good person," Julia began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I thought that because I followed the rules, because I did my job well, I was somehow better than others. But I was wrong. I was blind to the prejudices I held, to the ways I judged people based on their appearance, their background, and their race. And in doing so, I hurt people. I hurt Evelyn, and I hurt myself." She paused, looking at Evelyn, who sat across from her, her face calm but with an understanding in her eyes that Julia could never quite express in words. Evelyn had never asked for Julia's apology. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply given Julia the opportunity to change, the chance to learn, to become better. "I will never be the same person I was before," Julia continued, her voice stronger now, "but I know that I have the power to change, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the second chance I've been given." The room was silent for a moment, before Evelyn nodded. Her eyes, once filled with disappointment, now held something deeper. A quiet pride in the woman who had learned to recognize her flaws and face them. "It's not about perfection, Julia. It's about learning to be better, every day." Evelyn's words were simple, yet profound. "And you've taken the first step." As Julia walked out of the room, she felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of her past mistakes would always be with her, but now she carried them with the understanding that they didn't define her. What defined her now was the effort she was making to be better. And with that realization, the journey didn't end. It had just begun. In the weeks that followed, Julia took on a new role in the airline. She began leading training sessions on racial awareness and cultural sensitivity for new flight attendants, sharing her own story, her struggles, and her growth. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. True leadership wasn't about commanding respect, it was about earning it through humility and empathy. And as she stood before the young trainees, sharing her story, she couldn't help but think back to that day in the airport, when Evelyn Crawford had taught her the most important lesson of all, that the strongest people are not those who demand respect, but those who offer it even when they've been wronged. "Treat everyone with fairness," Julia said to her trainees, her voice filled with conviction. "Because we all carry stories that you can't see. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong." As she finished speaking, she felt a sense of peace settle within her, a peace that came from knowing she was no longer the person she had once been. She was better now. And as long as she kept striving to be better, there was hope. The story wasn't over for Julia Monroe. It was just the beginning.